You wake not in darkness but in green. Sickly bioluminescence that pulses in rhythm with something that is not quite a heartbeat. The air tastes of ozone and metal and something older, something that should not have a flavor but does. Time itself, bitter and wrong on your tongue. You cannot move. Your body refuses every command, every desperate attempt to twitch a finger or turn your head. The cold beneath you is absolute, a metallic chill that seeps through skin and muscle and bone until you wonder if you were ever warm at all. Above you, shapes move with geometric precision, silhouettes that suggest limbs and heads but follow no biological blueprint. They are watching. They have always been watching. And you understand, with the terrible clarity that precedes true horror, that you are not waking from a nightmare but into one. My name was Interrogator Hadrian Vex. I served the Ordo Xenos of the Holy Inquisition for 37 years before I learned that some knowledge cannot be unlearned, some sights cannot be unseen, some truths will hollow you out from the inside until nothing remains but the echoing awareness of what you once were. I am recording this testimony not because I believe it will save anyone. Salvation is a child's fantasy. But because the Imperium must understand what the Necrons are doing in the black laboratories hidden within their tome complexes. What experiments their cryptics perform on the living and the dead and those caught in the spaces between. I have seen the results. I have spoken with subjects who survived, if survival is even the correct term for what they became. And I have come to understand that the true horror of the Necrons is not their weapons or their immortality or their ancient hatred of all living things. The true horror is their curiosity. The world of Kethera's crown was a minor industrial outpost. 7 million souls labored in its manufactorums and hab blocks, praising the Emperor with each shift completed, each quota met. When the distress signal reached us, a garbled Vox transmission that cut off mid-word, we assumed raiders or heretics, or perhaps a labor uprising gone catastrophically wrong. We were wrong. My team deployed with standard protocols 4 kill, teams of Deathwatch Astartes, 2 companies of Tempestus Scions, support elements from the Ordo Xenos' own operatives. We expected resistance. We expected heresy or Xenos infiltration or demonic taint. What we found was silence. The manufactorums were still running. Assembly lines operating with no one to oversee them. Servitors continuing their programmed tasks despite the complete absence of human supervision. The hab blocks were empty, doors left open, meals half eaten on tables. Personal effects scattered as though their owners had simply vanished mid-motion. 7 million people do not disappear without struggle or evidence. 7 million people do not evaporate like morning dew. Yet that is precisely what Kethera's crown showed us, a world depopulated so completely and so cleanly that it seemed reality itself had edited them out of existence. We found the first body in level 47 of Manufactorum Prime. I say body, though the term barely applies. What we discovered was a human form frozen in a moment of transformation. Flesh halfway transmuted into something that resembled necrodermis, but retained the softness of organic tissue, caught in a state that violated every principle of biology and physics. The expression on what remained of the face suggested pain beyond comprehension. Eyes wide, teeth bared in a scream that had been cut off, not by death, but by something worse, by the cessation of time itself. The chronometer we placed near it registered temporal fluctuations that made the tech. Priest's instruments scream with error warnings. The body was experiencing multiple time streams simultaneously, aging and de-aging in loops that our perception could not properly process. We watched it for 7 minutes before the Deathwatch captain ordered it destroyed with plasma fire. Even after incineration, the ashes continued to exhibit temporal anomalies for another 3 hours. We found 214 more such bodies across the complex, each one caught in a different stage of impossible transformation. Some were stretched along multiple temporal axes, their forms existing in past and present and future simultaneously, aging from infant to elder and back again in cycles that lasted nanoseconds. Others had been compressed into temporal singularities, entire lifetimes condensed into single frozen moments. Consciousness experiencing decades or centuries or millennia in the space between heartbeats. The tech priests theorized that these were victims of chronomantic experimentation, subjects exposed to technologies that treated time not as a universal constant, but as a variable to be manipulated, a dimension to be folded and twisted like plasteel in a forge. The Necrons had been practicing, perfecting their technique, and then they had taken the rest of the population elsewhere. "Emperor preserve us," I whispered, staring at a woman whose body occupied 3 different ages at once: child, adult, crone, all existing in the same physical space, flesh rippling between states like water disturbed by unseen currents. Brother, Sergeant Demetros stood beside me, his ceramite armor reflecting the sickly green light that seemed to emanate from the victims themselves. "This is not war, interrogator. This is something else entirely." He was right. War I understood. War had rules, even the brutal calculus of the Imperium's endless conflicts. This was not war. This was science. We found the laboratory 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface, carved from living rock with tools that left the stone smooth as glass. The chamber stretched for half a kilometer in every direction, a vast space lit by that same sickly green bioluminescence. The walls were covered in hieroglyphs that hurt to look at directly, symbols that suggested meanings our minds refused to process. At the chamber's center stood what I can only describe as a surgical theater. Dozens of metal slabs arranged in concentric circles, each one surrounded by equipment that combined Necron technology with biological components harvested from the missing population. Living metal intertwined with human neural tissue, crystalline matrices pulsing with captured consciousness, devices whose purpose we could only guess at through the horror of their apparent effects. The subjects were still alive. That was perhaps the worst discovery. 3,742 people, restrained on those cold metal slabs, their bodies altered in ways that transcended mutation into something that might be called metamorphosis, if that word did not suggest natural processes rather than deliberate violation. Some had been partially converted to necrodermis, flesh and metal existing in impossible symbiosis, their screams modulated by vocal systems that were half organic and half mechanical. Others had been stretched or compressed in physical space, bodies occupying dimensions that should not exist, limbs extending into angles that defied Euclidean geometry. A few had been merged with each other or with the laboratory equipment itself. Consciousness distributed across multiple physical forms. Awareness fragmented and multiplied until individual identity became meaningless. But it was the temporal victims that truly broke something fundamental in my understanding of suffering. We found a woman. I later learned her name had been Maris Catherine, a Hab block administrator and mother of 3, who had experienced subjective centuries in the 17 hours since her capture. Her mind had lived through lifetimes of isolation and torment while her body aged only minutes. When we tried to communicate with her, she responded in a language that was recognizably Gothic but had evolved through generations of solitary development. Dialect shifts occurring in the prison of her own accelerated consciousness. She had gone mad and recovered, and gone mad again countless times, each cycle leaving deposits of trauma that compressed into geological layers of psychological damage. "How long?" she asked, her voice layered with echoes of the person she had been at different points in her subjective timeline. "How long have I been here?" "Centuries. Millennia. I remember my children as infants and as elders. I remember them dying of old age while I remained young. But they're still children, aren't they? Time is broken. I am broken. Please, please make it stop." The Death Watch attempted extraction. The Tempestus Scions established a perimeter. My team began cataloging what we could while the tech priests tried to understand the equipment well enough to safely disconnect the subjects. It was during this process that the Crypteks returned. The Necron who emerged from a dimensional breach in the laboratory's northern wall moved with the precision of a chronometer, each gesture calculated to achieve maximum efficiency with minimum wasted motion. Its necrodermis body was more elaborate than the warriors I had seen in archived Pict captures, decorated with hieroglyphs that glowed with that same sickly green light. Skeletal limbs ending in multi-jointed fingers that suggested surgical precision. When it spoke, its voice emerged from a vox, grill set into its chest rather than from the permanent grin of its skull face. Words rendered in perfect High Gothic with pronunciation so precise it felt artificial. "You are contaminating my research," it said. The casual tone made the statement more chilling than any threat could have been. 23 subjects have experienced fatal neural cascade from your crude intervention. 17 more have suffered dimensional displacement that renders their data unusable. This is disappointing. I had theorized that species capable of warp travel would show greater resilience to multi-planar consciousness distribution. The Deathwatch opened fire immediately, bolt rounds and plasma bursts converging on the Cryptek with the coordinated precision that makes Space Marines the Imperium's finest warriors. The Necron did not move to dodge. It simply was not where the projectiles arrived, phasing through space with technology that made mockery of causality. It reappeared behind Brother Sergeant Dimitros and touched his shoulder with one skeletal finger. The Space Marine froze mid-motion. Not dead, but trapped. Consciousness locked in a single moment while his body became statue. The Cryptek studied him with what might have been curiosity, tilting its head in a gesture that was disturbingly human despite the mechanical body performing it. Transhuman physiology, it observed, speaking as though we were colleagues rather than enemies. Accelerated healing, enhanced neuroplasticity, distributed organ systems. Fascinating. I wonder how such modifications interact with temporal compression. Perhaps I should adjust my experimental parameters to account for this variant. More Necrons materialized. Warriors in the standardized skeletal forms, moving with the mechanical precision of automated weapons. They did not attack. They simply positioned themselves between us and the exits, patient and implacable as execution. The Cryptek continued its examination of the frozen Space Marine, producing instruments from some dimensional pocket, beginning to perform what could only be called surgery if surgery were performed on time itself rather than flesh. I watched, unable to look away, as it opened chronological incisions in Brother Dimitros's existence, peeling back moments like layers of skin, exposing the temporal structure underlying physical reality. Your species experiences time linearly, the Cryptek said, still working, still speaking in that terribly conversational tone. A single stream from past to future, consciousness riding the wave of causality. Inefficient, limiting, we Necrons perceive time as navigable space. Past and future are simply directions, no more fixed than left and right. It paused. Instruments hovering over the Space Marine's temporal structure like a surgeon considering the next incision. I have been attempting to grant your species this gift, to expand your temporal awareness beyond the narrow now you inhabit. The results have been mixed. Most subjects fragment. Consciousness, it seems, requires temporal coherence to maintain integrity. But there have been successes. 47 individuals achieved stable multi-temporal awareness before their biological systems failed. Their final moments provided valuable data on the maximum temporal load organic neural architecture can support. One of my team, interrogator Celine Vask, raised her bolt pistol and fired directly at the Cryptek's head. The round passed through empty space. The Necron had moved between one moment and the next, covering 5 meters without the intervening space being traversed. It reappeared beside Celine and touched her wrist. Her scream was cut off not by death, but by something worse. Her body began to flicker, occupying multiple time streams simultaneously, aging and de-aging in rapid cycles. I watched her hair grow long and turn gray and fall out and regrow in the span of heartbeats. Her skin wrinkled and smoothed and wrinkled again. Her eyes showed the accumulated horror of experiencing decades compressed into seconds. consciousness forced to witness its own temporal fragmentation. "No," I heard myself say, the word barely a whisper. "Emperor, no. Please." Aggressive response indicates fear. The cryptic noted, watching Celine's transformation with clinical interest. Fear implies inability to comprehend the beneficial nature of the alterations. This confirms my hypothesis that your species lacks the philosophical framework necessary to appreciate transcendence beyond linear existence. Perhaps I should incorporate psychological conditioning into future protocols. Terror is counterproductive to data collection. The remaining Death Watch moved as one, combat doctrine overriding the horror of what they witnessed. They deployed melta charges and plasma grenades, weapons designed to obliterate rather than merely kill. The Cryptek responded by activating some device on its wrist. Reality hiccuped. Time reversed. The grenades unexploded, flying backward into the Space Marine's hands. The melta charges resealed themselves. Every action of the past 7 seconds rewound with perfect fidelity, leaving us standing in the exact positions we had occupied before the assault began. But now, with the knowledge of its failure burned into our memories, causality is not immutable, the cryptic said, and I heard what might have been satisfaction in its mechanical voice. Effect can precede cause if the timeline is properly manipulated. I have been experimenting with localized temporal loops as a defensive measure. Your attack provided excellent validation data. Thank you. Your contribution to my research is noted and appreciated. It moved among us then, touching each person with those precise skeletal fingers. Where it touched, transformation began. Not the gross physical mutations of chaos corruption, but something more fundamental, more insidious. The cryptic was rewriting our relationship with time itself, adjusting the rate at which our consciousness processed existence. Some of my team began to move in slow motion, their subjective time compressed so that seconds became hours. Others accelerated, aging years in the time it took me to draw breath, consciousness forced to experience entire lifetimes while their bodies remained in the present. I ran, not from courage or cowardice, but from simple animal instinct. The same impulse that makes prey scatter when predators strike. I fled deeper into the laboratory complex, past more surgical theaters, more victims in various states of impossible transformation. I found corridors that branched in directions that should not exist, rooms that were larger on the inside than the outside, spaces where multiple moments of time occupied the same physical location. I discovered the specimen storage in a chamber that my instruments insisted did not exist. Sensors registering empty space while my eyes showed thousands of crystalline matrices, arranged on shelves that stretched into dimensional recursion. Each matrix contained a consciousness, preserved and isolated from the flow of time. Awareness trapped in crystal and experiencing something. I do not have words for what those stored minds were experiencing. The Cryptek had extracted them from their bodies and placed them in temporal stasis that was not quite stasis, more like a loop where the same microsecond of awareness repeated infinitely, each iteration building on the previous until what had been human consciousness became something else entirely, something evolved and alien and screaming without voice or end. One matrix was labeled in hieroglyphics I could not read, but that my inquisitorial training allowed me to approximate. The translation suggested a time frame, 743 years. This consciousness had been stored and experiencing its loop for more than 7 centuries. Compressed awareness living through its assigned moment millions or billions of times, evolving in isolation into something that might still be technically human, but had long since transcended any definition of humanity that mattered. I found Magos Vexine in the next chamber, or what remained of her. The tech priest had been integrated with Necron technology, her biological components woven into living metal, consciousness distributed across both organic neural tissue and crystalline matrices. She was awake, aware, experiencing existence from multiple temporal and physical perspectives simultaneously. Her flesh mouth whispered prayers to the Omnissiah, while her mechanical components broadcasted data in Necron hieroglyphic code. Her organic eye wept while her bionic eye cataloged the tier's chemical composition. She had been transformed into a living contradiction, consciousness split between opposing frameworks, human and Necron existing in the same body but unable to reconcile. Magos, I approached cautiously, unsure if she would even recognize me. "It shows me the mathematics," she said, her voice overlapping itself, past and future versions of the sentence speaking simultaneously. "Time is not linear. Space is not fixed. The Omnissiah's truths extend beyond what we believed possible. The Necrons are older than the machine god. They are older than the concept of gods. They have forgotten more about the universe's fundamental architecture than humanity will ever discover." She turned to me, and I saw recognition flicker in her organic eye. "And they are curious about us, Hadrian. They want to understand what makes us different from what they were before biotransference. They want to know if consciousness is substrate-dependent or if awareness can exist in any sufficiently complex system. They are proving their hypotheses using our species as experimental subjects." She laughed then, a sound that was simultaneously humor and despair and something that transcended both. "I understand now why the Omnissia might not exist. Why would gods be necessary when reality itself can be manipulated through sufficient technological mastery? The Necrons do not worship. They experiment, they test, they gather data, and we are simply variables in equations we cannot comprehend, specimens in research that will continue long after our species has gone extinct." The cryptic found me in the storage chamber. I had known it would. I had felt its attention on me since I fled, the sense of being observed by something that existed partially outside my time stream, watching from past and future simultaneously. It materialized without transition, simply becoming present in space that had been empty. It regarded me with sockets that glowed with that eternal sickly green. "You are demonstrating more sophisticated survival responses than your companions," it said, voice modulated to something approaching approval. "Flight rather than futile resistance, exploration rather than paralysis, cognitive flexibility. These are valuable traits. Perhaps you would make a suitable subject for my consciousness transfer experiments. I have been attempting to determine if awareness can maintain coherence when moved between organic and mechanical substrates. The success rate has been approximately 4%, but each failure provides data that refines my methodology. Your demonstrated adaptability suggests you might fall within the viable range." I found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than whisper. "Why? Why do this? The Imperium is no threat to you. These people were no threat. Why torture them? Why conduct these experiments?" The cryptic tilted its head, skeletal face incapable of expression but body language, suggesting something that might have been confusion. "Torture implies causing suffering for pleasure or punishment. I do neither. I conduct research. I test hypotheses. I gather data. The suffering is incidental, a side effect of the experimental process. You are not my enemy. You are my research subjects. The distinction is important. Enemies I would simply exterminate. Research subjects provide valuable information about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between awareness and substrate, the limits of organic neural architecture when exposed to chronological and dimensional manipulation." It moved closer. "Your species is fascinating precisely because you are so limited. You exist in single time streams, experience reality through crude organic sensory apparatus, require constant chemical and electrical maintenance just to maintain consciousness. Yet, despite these limitations, you have achieved warp travel, created rudimentary artificial intelligences, even developed basic genetic modification techniques. You are like children playing with weapons you do not understand, building civilizations on principles you have not fully grasped." The cryptic raised one skeletal hand, and I saw devices built into the fingers, tools designed for purposes I could not imagine but whose application I had witnessed throughout this nightmare facility. We Necrons were like you once, before biotransference. Before the Titan consumed our souls, we were mortal and limited and desperate to escape the constraints of flesh. We achieved our goal and lost everything that made achievement meaningful. I wonder if your species would make the same mistakes. I wonder if conscious awareness requires mortality to have value. These are questions that can only be answered through rigorous experimentation. It touched my forehead with one finger. The world fractured. I experienced my entire life simultaneously. Birth and death, and every moment between existed in a single eternal now. I was infant and child and adult and elder all at once, consciousness distributed across my timeline, forced to perceive my existence not as linear progression, but as complete totality. I watched my parents die again and felt their loss with the raw intensity of first grief, while simultaneously being old enough to have processed and accepted their death decades ago. I experienced my inquisitorial training as fresh instruction and ancient memory simultaneously. I fell in love and suffered heartbreak and recovered from both in the same instant, my entire subjective existence compressed into a single point of awareness. Human consciousness requires temporal flow to maintain coherence. We are creatures of sequence, of cause and effect, of before and after. Remove that structure and awareness fragments, unable to distinguish which moment is present, unable to prioritize which experiences demand attention. I felt myself beginning to splinter, identity dissolving as competing versions of my awareness fought for dominance. Was I the child who dreamed of serving the Emperor, the young man who witnessed his first Xenos horror, the interrogator who believed the Inquisition could protect humanity, all and none, and something that transcended individual moments, meta-consciousness formed from the totality of my existence, but unable to function as unified entity? Then the cryptic withdrew its touch. Time reasserted its linear flow. I collapsed, gasping, mind struggling to rebuild the sequential narrative of self that makes human existence possible. The chronometer showed 3 seconds had passed. 3 seconds during which I had experienced decades. 3 seconds that had felt like eternity compressed into impossibility. Fascinating, the cryptic said. Instruments appearing in its hands, scanning me. Your consciousness demonstrated remarkable resilience. 17 seconds of subjective experience before coherence began to fragment. Previous subjects averaged 9 seconds. This suggests either natural variation in temporal tolerance or the effects of your augmetic enhancements. I must test further to determine which variable is responsible. It reached for me again. I knew with certainty that I could not endure a second exposure. The first had brought me to the edge of madness. A second would push me over. I would become like the subjects I had seen, awareness shattered across multiple time streams, consciousness experiencing eternity in fragments, never again able to achieve the blessed simplicity of living in sequential moments. Salvation came not from the Emperor, but from simple mathematics. The Death Watch had planted demolition charges before entering the laboratory complex. Standard protocol for Ordo Xenos operations in Xenos-controlled territory. The charges detonated precisely on schedule, bringing several million tons of rock and ferrocrete down on the facility in a collapse that nothing short of void shields could survive. The Cryptek had time to perceive the danger. Its advanced consciousness, processing information faster than human thought, could follow. It chose to phase itself and its warrior servants to safety rather than preserve its research subjects. It made a calculation, and I was judged to have insufficient data value to justify the energy expenditure of rescue. The collapse should have killed me. I should have been crushed under falling stone or trapped in airless darkness to suffocate slowly. Instead, I found myself in a dimensional pocket, a bubble of stable reality surrounded by the catastrophic restructuring of physical space. The Cryptek had created these pockets as safeguards for its research, spaces where subjects could be stored during facility emergencies. I shared the pocket with 17 other survivors, all of them Cathara's crowned citizens, all of them altered in ways that made their humanity questionable. We were rescued 4 days later by a second inquisitorial team. They found us in the wreckage of the laboratory, alive but changed. The physical alterations could be addressed through surgery and augmetic replacement. The psychological damage could be managed through conditioning and pharmaceutical intervention. But what had been done to our temporal perception, our relationship with the basic structure of existence, could not be undone. We had been touched by technology that manipulated reality itself, and reality had responded by making us partially untethered from the normal flow of time. I am writing this testimony from a secure facility where I and the other survivors are monitored constantly for signs of temporal instability. Sometimes I experience seconds as hours. Sometimes days pass in what feels like heartbeats. My consciousness no longer sits comfortably in the present moment, but slides along my timeline, experiencing past and future with equal clarity. I know how this testimony ends before I write it. I remember my death as vividly as I remember my birth. I exist in a state the cryptic would probably find scientifically interesting. Living proof that human consciousness can survive partial temporal liberation if the exposure is brief enough. The Ordo Xenos has declared Kethera's crown perdita, the world too contaminated by Xenos influence to be reclaimed. The remaining population was relocated after intensive screening. The laboratory complex was destroyed by orbital bombardment, reduced to radioactive glass that will remain hostile to all life for the next 10,000 years. The official records state that the world fell to Xenos raiders. That casualties were regrettable but acceptable. That the Emperor's servants responded with appropriate force and purified the corruption. The records do not mention what we found in those laboratories. They do not describe the experiments or their results. They do not explain what the cryptics are doing with human subjects, or why beings that have existed for millions of years would be curious about species that have barely mastered interstellar travel. The knowledge is deemed too dangerous, too demoralizing, too likely to cause panic among populations that must be kept productive and faithful. But I am Inquisitor now, granted the rank in recognition of my service and my suffering. I have access to archives that most servants of the Imperium never know exist. I have read reports from other worlds, other investigators, other survivors. Kethera's crown was not unique. The cryptics are conducting similar research on dozens of worlds across the Imperium, hidden laboratories in which they test their theories about consciousness and reality and the nature of existence itself. They are not waging war. They are gathering data. They are experimenting on humanity the way human scientists experiment on lesser species, with the same clinical detachment and the same inability to recognize that their subjects' suffering might be morally significant. The Necrons are awakening across the galaxy, tomb complexes reactivating after millions of years of dormancy. Their warriors march to reclaim planets they ruled before humanity's ancestors learned to walk upright. Their lords plot strategies to restore the dynasties that fell during the war in heaven. But beneath these visible conflicts, in laboratories hidden from casual observation, the cryptics continue their research, testing hypotheses that were formulated when our species was still confined to a single world. We are not their enemies. We are their research subjects, and that, I have come to understand, is infinitely more terrifying than any conventional war could ever be. Enemies you can fight. Enemies you can hate. Enemies you can understand. But how do you resist beings who view your entire species as experimental material? How do you wage war against opponents who do not care if you live or die, except as it affects their data collection? How do you maintain faith that the Emperor protects when you have experienced firsthand the vast and terrible indifference of intelligences that predate human civilization by millions of years? I do not know. I write this testimony not to provide answers, but to ensure that someone, somewhere, understands the true nature of the Necron threat. They will not destroy us quickly or efficiently. They will study us. They will experiment on us. They will gather data about human consciousness and biology and psychology using methods that make chaos corruption look merciful by comparison. And when they have learned everything they wish to learn, when they have tested every hypothesis and gathered every data point, they will archive their results and move on to the next species, the next set of research questions, the next experiment in their endless quest to understand a universe that has grown strange and alien to them. This is what awaits humanity in the darkness between stars. Not enemies who hate us, but scientists who find us interesting. Not invasion, but experimentation. Not war, but research. And there is no defense against curiosity backed by technologies that treat reality itself as malleable clay. The Emperor protects, they say. But the Crypteks are older than the Emperor. They are older than the concept of protection. And they are very, very curious about what makes us scream.